Hello and welcome to the 20th episode of Called to the Bar International Law Over Drinks, a series of casual conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. Insert applause sound. In these conversations, we are speaking off the cuff and without the benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer reviewed. I'm Dr. Juliette McIntyre, lecturer in law at the University of South Australia. And tonight I have one wonderful co-host and one wonderful guest to discuss the topic of the United Nations Security Council and its reform. What is it? Is it possible? And what alternative futures can we imagine? With me is Dr. Tamsin Phillipa Paige, senior lecturer at Deakin Law School. She wrote the book, literally, on UN Security Council decision-making, has also studied Somali piracy, and does law and literature research using popular fiction to understand social perceptions of the law. This means she has written about both pirates real and pirates fictional. Welcome, Tamsin.
Thank you.
We are joined tonight by Professor Aoife O'Donoghue of Queen's University Belfast. Aoife's work critically examines how legal structures enable or prevent states, institutions, and individuals to act, or more specifically, not act, and the ramifications of such. She is the author of two excellent CUP monographs, the latest of which is On Tyranny and the Global Legal Order, in which she establishes a taxonomy of tyranny and applies it to the current global legal order. Sounds rather like that might be relevant to our current conversation. Welcome, Aoife.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be invited on this excellent podcast.
And it's good morning to you and good evening for Tamsin and I. So, first question, what's your drink?
Well, my actual drink is rum. So I'm a bit of a rum nerd, which fits in with pirates. So my favorite typical would be Diplomatico, which is a Venezuelan rum, or Ronza Capa, which is a Guatemalan rum. Though a friend of mine just got me a lovely bottle of Kraken rum, which is sour cherry and vanilla, which in our northern hemisphere winter is delicious. But because it is actually 9:30 a.m. for me and I have other things at work, I'm actually drinking my favorite brand of tea, which is Barry's, a tea from Cork, where I'm from. And that's probably the thing I drink the most of, that I drink volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes of this tea.
Tamsin?
I, first of all, have a recommendation on some rum that I need to dig up the name of the distillery in Seychelles that I used to hang out a lot when I was doing piracy fieldwork in Seychelles. It's a gorgeous Seychelles agricole rum. They do everything.
Oh, agricole, yes.
They do everything from kind of the quick distilled white rum to like 8-year aged agricole rum that is just block of ice and a dash of lime, and it's good to go. So I'll have to dig up the name of the distillery because I haven't got it off the top of my head, but phenomenal. I, however, no longer drink, so I don't have a drink tonight in that regard, but I do have an apricot white tea from my favorite tea merchants, Tea Runners. It's white tea with a lot of dried apricot, but it's also got some licorice root and some lemongrass and some rose petals in it. It's really light and kind of refreshing.
Lovely. And look, to the potential horror of some of our regular listeners, I'm actually drinking tea as well. It's a lovely oolong with cinnamon and fennel and other herbs and spices added in, which is very nice. I'm trying to restore my immune system from recent low points. So, moving on now, we usually begin each of these shows with a little bit of background on our lives and career paths. And Tamsin, of course, has covered this in a previous episode. But Aoife, as a first-time guest, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how it is that you got into international law and the career path that has brought you to your current job.
Sure. So anyone who knows me will find this quite hilarious, but originally I wanted to be a diplomat. I was definitely going to do that. And so on that basis, when I went to University College Cork, where I did my undergrad and where I'm from, I basically picked all the international law subjects because I felt, well, this is what I want to do. This will be useful. And I did that when I went to St. Louis as well for a year. And then I did my master's in London on international law. And while I was waiting to do the civil service exams, a job came up at the University of Galway teaching contract and equity. And I thought it was a contract, and I was like, sure, I'll give that a go. You never know. And I discovered I really liked it. Like, I really liked teaching. I really enjoyed being in front of a class. And I really liked having the time to sort of read all the nerdy things that I wanted to read. So the civil service exams went. I did do them, but while extremely hungover. So that sort of, I think, was a subconscious way of me telling myself that actually, no, you don't want this job. Um, so I was in Galway for about 2.5 years, and I started doing research then on things like good offices, UN Secretary General, good offices and trade. And then I started doing stuff on global constitutionalism. It was quite like it had just sort of taken off, and I was kind of perplexed because I couldn't understand how people were just relabeling them and things and then claiming it was democratic or there was a separation of powers and stuff. So I started doing my PhD as an external student at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands then at that point. And that's when I went to Durham. So I was in Durham for 15 years. I was there for quite a long time. In UK terms, that's like forever. Um, so I stayed there for 15 years. I met my husband, I got married, had 2 kids, and I had a great time. I loved working in Durham. It was a brilliant place to work. I got to work with there were actually no international lawyers when I arrived, except for Holly Cullen, who was so kind and sweet and lovely to me when I first started, sort of flailing about the place, not knowing what to do.
She is
Um,
also my PhD student now.
oh, wow. I'd imagine that's very intense supervision there.
Oh, look, I think it's the easiest supervision I'm ever going to have in my career.
So like Holly was fantastic. And then about 2 years ago, I moved back to the island because I'm from the Republic, but I moved back to the island, and I live now in Belfast, working at Queen's. And I love it. I love being back. I love being back on the island. It's fantastic. It's great. Belfast is a great place to work, and Queen's is a lovely place to work and live. And I've been doing a lot on Brexit in Northern Ireland, on the kind of trade aspects and human rights aspects of it. So it was nice to actually be here and having that discussion, but also because I've been doing a lot of stuff on feminist constitutionalism and judgments, which have been Ireland based. So that's been great. So I do a lot of stuff, and Tamsin knows this, on utopias as well as tyranny. I like to use lots of different methods from the social sciences through to the humanities. So my work can be like super disparate to describe what it is that I do. But it is basically, it is kind of like trying to uncover how power works, but also kind of trying to argue that some things that seem unfeasible are actually feasible, which is, I think, kind of related to what we're going to discuss today.
Yeah,
So that's me.
definitely. Oh, fantastic. Well, that's a great segue then into our main topic this evening. But let's maybe begin with a little bit of backgrounding, a little bit of history, because as listeners will no doubt be familiar, the UN Security Council was established back in 1945, reflecting the political power balance of the immediate aftermath of World War II. It's got 15 members at any one time, but there are, of course, 5 more important than anyone else. And these are the veto-wielding 5 permanent members: the US, China, Russia, UK, and France. So, Tamsin, can you tell us a little bit more about how we ended up with this structure in the first place before we get into talking about how you might go about changing it? I mean, like, what's so special about France, for example?
Okay, so as you've noted, the P5 represents the political allies through World War II, and they were kind of the driving force behind the San Francisco conference that led to the UN Charter. I would say, and even back then they said it was the 4 major powers and France. So even back then, France was not being considered a major power.
Poor
My
France.
understanding of going through archival material is that France ended up in this club of 5 that have been elevated above everyone else for the mandate of maintaining international peace and security out of a combination of pity because of what happened in ending World War II, and the fact that Charles de Gaulle was, as a person, was a force of nature and force of personality alone from Charles de Gaulle elevated France into that club and into that room of drafting of the major in the drafting of these major powers who, in drafting the UN Charter, position themselves as the permanent members, position themselves with a veto over any collective action through the Security Council as part of the drafting of the UN Charter if you want to be part of our new world order, this is how it's going to play out. And it's worth noting that we're still pretty colonial time then, so you didn't have the same number of states around to engage in pushback against that. I think at the initial completion of the charter in San Francisco, there was 51 or 52 states, three of whom were members of the USSR. So you don't have all of the 195 member states plus two observers that we have currently to kind of push back against this division of power of the P5 who, and every time I come back to kind of framing the P5 power, I come back to Simon Chesterman's work on rule of law, where he notes that the Security Council, because there is no judicial oversight of the Security Council, is in a rule by law framework, not a rule of law framework. By positioning themselves above everyone else in the Security Council. But I also note Inger Osterdal at Uppsala University made this wonderful quote in the late 90s of, and I may have this somewhat wrong because I don't have it in front of me, the Security Council can do whatever it likes and it will be considered legal. And that's kind of, it's really important to understand that that's the level of power the Security Council has given itself for the maintenance of international peace and security. And, you know, when we talk about why it's powerful, Article 25 says that any decision by the Security Council is legally binding on all member states. So they can functionally make international law by agreement. And it's binding on everyone if the P5 all agree not to veto it. So we can't underestimate the amount of power that the P5 gave themselves over the world through this, to the point where Aoife has edited this chapter that I've written with one of my other PhD students, Joanne Sag. I have made the argument that the UN, by virtue of the structure of the Security Council, has set itself up on fascist ideals, fascist utopian ideals of peace and unity through strength, but because of infighting and a lack of accountability has descended into a dystopian fascist state where everyone has to simply survive the whims of the P5.
I would really echo Tamsin's point there at the end. I think that the tremendous amount of power that it has and has on people's bodily lives. I know the counterterrorism lists aren't what we're talking about today, but to me, that's one of the most appalling structures there are in international law, where they're, you know, I know they set up an ombudsperson and there was a report, but as far as I'm concerned, they are both long ways. And one of the things that really bothers me about it is that the standards, especially liberal democracies claim, must be upheld at the domestic level. By no way does that happen with the Security Council. And then they often, particularly the P5, will use the Security Council as cover to do things domestically that constitutionally could not happen because of things like the rule of law, democratic legitimacy. What's also particularly interesting, just following what you said, was like how a moment in time gets frozen in international law. So you have this moment in 1945 and it gets, you know, that's the moment of creation. And then that gets pushed into the future as far, you know, into perpetuity, that it creates a sort of immutable character, you know, that was dependent on people like Charles de Gaulle, was dependent on the 51 people there, and, you know, the I think 5 women who actually were there to sign the charter on the day. And but of course it's not that it creates this idea of immutability of that structure, but where it's not, like the kind of, there are moments of rupture and chaos. That's how it came into existence. It was a moment of rupture and chaos that created it. So other moments of rupture and chaos could, you know, dismantle it at the same time, you know, and we are, but it's the magnitude of that. And of course also that it has changed, you know, like it has changed. You know, Taiwan used to sit in China's seat. It used to have fewer members, and they changed that in the 1960s. There was supposed to be an active military committee. I think they still meet. There's some pictures on the UN website, military committee hanging out together. But I mean, they don't do anything. So to me, the sort of, it creates an impression impression of this sort of immutable moment that is still, which kind of masks actually the fact that things have shifted, things have changed. It's not the same body that it was. Though absolutely agreeing with Tamsin, I think that the way the power it has, the way it wields that power to create courts, to impact on people's individual lives is extraordinary. And, that's basically what the book on tyranny was saying. In any other place, we'd call this a tyranny. That's what it is.
Yeah. It's fascinating. The point you make about the immutability as well, it reminds me of some constitutional debates you see in domestic bases where, the idea of a referendum or changing your constitution seems wildly controversial, but actually, that's kind of, you're supposed to do that.
I mean, on that note, I love hearing about Americans talk about the original founders of the Constitution and ignoring that there's a whole stack of literal amendments. They're called amendments there. And it's just like, really, it's that immutable when you literally have a whole section called the first to whatever amendment. And that wasn't part of the original founders' intentions, and yet you're still claiming originalism. Yeah, sorry, easy opportunity to have a bit of a dig at American constitutional lawyers.
Oh, so I mean, and this leads really well into the sort of, I guess, heart of the discussion today, because African leaders at the General Assembly in the last few weeks have been making their case for reform of this institution of the Security Council. And the US has, interestingly enough, announced that it would indeed support the creation of 2 permanent but non-veto holding seats for African countries. Aoife, what are your thoughts on this proposal? I mean, why an African country, not, for example, a Latin American country? What's your take on it?
So my first thought was, just because I'm old, we've been here before, right? So this was I was like, oh, okay, we're back to this. And on that part, I do think it's useful that Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has chosen this as his kind of legacy thing for the final years. And I mean, that's not unusual either. Lots of UN Secretary Generals do that. But the fact that he did push this forward, but I thought it was interesting that he pushed it forward in partnership with the Global South states. And I do think that's different. All the previous ones, when I was looking back, the ones under Boutros Boutros-Ghali or the ones that Kofi Annan led, they all really were UN headquarter led. Whereas this seems, anyway, to actually be taking up something that is in line with what particularly the African Union has been arguing for at least 20 years now, this type of proposal. So I think that's an interesting, and I think it's Guterres has been, I think, gaining more. I probably didn't have the greatest sort of view of his leadership in his first 4 years, but again, as with a lot of Secretary Generals, the last 4 years, the fact that lots of people are giving out about him is probably good. He's falling foul of members, and UN Secretary Generals who fall foul of members usually means they're actually doing something positive. I also thought, looking at the proposals, what's interesting about them is the idea that the 2 African states, and that the African Union in their 2, like the proposals that came before this, have been very clear that they will set the criteria about who picks them. And I think that's a very interesting, because nobody is saying what countries those 2 countries would be. And obviously that is a very delicate choice, because if we, as Tamsin outlined, it was the 4 powers plus France. And, there wasn't any idea that group was representative of anything other than power. And even then they really weren't. I mean, China was in the middle of a civil war at the time. It's not the United Kingdom was about to lose its empire. Yesterday it lost another bit of the Chagos Islands. The original choice wasn't based on representativeness, but the African Union is clearly arguing it should be based on a set of criteria that they have not made clear. But I think that is an interesting question in itself, because Africa is such a huge, dynamic country with different sort of legal traditions, very different histories, very different approaches to international law, and also has been the place that's been the most subject of international law. Whether or not the African Union gets to if this goes forward, do they still get to pick? Or, I think that's an interesting, like, at what point where does the choice come from? Because there isn't any legal framework for that. One of the other things I thought was positive about it is, and I think this comes out of the fact that, this push is coming out of the global south more generally, and it's not just Africa, is that when Russia tried to derail it last week, they got rebutted. Like, Russia really thought that they were going to get that the summit document knocked aside, I think, using the very similar you ticked all the usual boxes, used all the usual words, did the usual, and it just didn't happen. And I think that becomes from the ownership of it, that they were like, actually, no, we're not. This nonsense is part of what we think is a problem. So I thought that was particularly interesting. On a more broader basis, I mean, it's very obvious, right, that places are underrepresented and not represented at all. Right? So that even with this proposal, there will be whole places, very obviously places where, there are territories where people live that aren't recognized. So, like, what happened? People of, Western Sahara, are they recognized? Does the state represent a continent? In that scenario, maybe the African states do, or do they represent themselves? I mean, sometimes I think maybe they think about themselves as a continent, but I don't think the United States ever sees itself as representing Mexico and Canada, and it's probably Mexico and Canada are also fine with that. But that's sort of like the Caribbean states as well. I mean, and obviously Australia, that there's underrepresentation, and then there's the absence of representation. And none of these proposals really tackle that for me, which I think is like, to go back to the counterterrorism lists, like that's an appalling artifact of 9/11 years. But it is the sort of thing that where I think we will still be left with a body. With these proposals, we'll be left with a body which is still under or non-representing some people, that can still have individual bodily effects on people and their day-to-day lives. So any change would be good. And as a pragmatic feminist, I'm happy to take the incremental while we move towards the big. Always happy to do that, because you have to be, that's feminists have been always doing that. But I do think it's not something that I think solves the kinds of issues that myself and Tamsin were talking about, whether it's rule of law, political and legal legitimacy. I'm not sure that it solves that to any greater extent, though it does go some way towards it.
Yeah, and so I have a whole bunch of concerns about the whole proposal. I think that the proposal for a rotating seat being added for small island states is a good thing and relatively uncontroversial. I don't think that we're going to see too much pushback against that. My biggest concern with the US proposal on how to do this is that caveat at the back of non-veto permanent members. And therein lies the height of US foreign policy arrogance, to think that they can get that through, while also just being condescendingly colonial. And the reason you can't get that through goes back to, and this is where I hate it when Douglas is right, that I am still a doctrinal lawyer sometimes. As much as I'm a sociologist, I'm so often still a doctrinal lawyer. But this goes back to Article 27.3 of the Charter, which is the veto. And this is this is the voting rules. Article 27.3 says, and I quote, "Decisions of the Security Council on all matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members, including the concurring votes of the permanent members." Continues on after that, but that's where I'm going to end. Right there, you have to redraft the entire veto provision to add permanent non-veto members. You're not just adding permanent members up in Article 23.1. You're also redrafting how the veto works. And I cannot see 2/3 of the states ratifying an amendment that amends the veto to further embed and enshrine P5 power to the exclusion of others.
Yeah,
Even regardless of incremental change, like I also am for incremental change. I'm for like we have to dream about utopias to know what we're working towards, but incremental change is how we get there. But I can't see even the African states who are getting made permanent states accepting that outright second class permanent citizenship on the Security Council. It's not going to happen, and it's arrogant and it's colonial to think that the US has the ability to dictate that and the capital to make it and the political capital and power to make it stick, because they just don't. And so any reform of the veto is going to require an inclusion in there that states can't exercise a veto over Security Council decisions which affect them directly, and none of the P5 will agree to that. So we're at this impasse where they're talking a good game that sounds really good until you get to the actual mechanics of making that change, and then you sit back and go, hang on, no one's going to accept this. And that's my concern with it. And I think that the US know that. I think the US put forward that proposal absolutely knowing that no one would accept it, so they can then sit back and say, well, we tried and you didn't accept it, so get fucked.
Yeah, because that was... Oh, sorry. Go on, Aoife.
No, I was going to say, I'm not sure. So I agree with the content of what you're saying. I'm not sure people won't go for it. The reason I'm not sure that they might get the 2/3 is because I had a look at the literature on this. I don't agree with it, but I was looking at the literature about why states want to be non-veto members of the Security Council and what comes along with it, right? So particularly like in Ireland, we're very good at getting on this, right? So Ireland, small neutral state, we love peacekeeping, even though they're out in the Lebanon now in a very awkward position, but doing their jobs. We're very, we get elected, and they really want to get elected. We beat Norway to the last seat. Like that was a lot of diplomatic time, effort, and capital. And I think the reason for that is partly because of the way the Security Council works, right? Because it is done behind closed doors. I mean, they all promised to vote for the new Secretary General in 2016 in an open vote, and then it got to the Security Council. We're like, no, we'll keep this private, because for any Hamilton fans out there, you want to be in the room where it happens. So they work hard, and there are benefits that come along with being on it, even for the short period. There's kind of a social, legal, political capital. You actually get better loans, apparently, from the IMF. You can access capital, apparently. There's capitalism coming in and adding it in, which I hadn't fully realized. But actually, it just raises your kind of so.
Oh yeah, I agree with all of that.
Yeah. But I think so. I think more states might vote for that because they would get in the room. Now, one of the other things in the proposal is about making the Security Council better at making decisions. And I do think Africa being there as not only the state that provides, I think, the most peacekeepers. I think that the continent with the most peacekeepers, and also the continent that's probably been the subject of these things, them being there would be good. But having said all that, without the veto, I 100% agree. It's just, we're basically saying, there's no African state that is civilized enough. We might as well use the 19th century language, right? That is what it's saying. It's saying they're not quite ready. They need a little more time. And for a bit of John Stuart Mill kind of language, they need a little more tuition, a little more time to be ready to wield that power. They're not. And that's basically what it's saying. I mean, it is very that is, having said all that stuff, I'm it really just sticks in the craw, because that is basically, you as a continent are still not civilized enough to wield this power. I mean, it's awful 19th century language, but I think that is, as with a lot of international law, frankly, that's actually what it comes down to. And that's I think if the states don't go for it, I agree with Tamsin. It'll be for that reason. It'll be because they are once again being told we have a group of first class, we have a group of second class, and we have a group of third class, and this is a group you're in.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's baking it in, isn't it, as well? Which is because my next question was going to be, what would be the point of a permanent but non-veto holding seat? And you've answered that, but it embeds that inequality to a much greater degree as well, adding additional tiers to it, which is really interesting.
I'd like to say, for anyone who's interested in that linguistic term that Aoife's using around "you're not civilized enough," our colleague on the podcast, Dina Savala, wrote a fantastic book on that whole point in international law. So
Yes.
you can go read that.
Yes,
and it's a brilliant book. Highly recommend it.
Yes,
brilliant book.
Award-winning indeed. So I mean, you mentioned, this isn't the first time that UN Security Council reform has been in the news. We've seen it come up again very recently in the context of events in the Middle East, and the fact that this veto is preventing the UN Security Council from maybe doing what it was supposed to do. But we've also seen it, for example, following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, when there were calls for Russia to be kicked off the council, and some, shall we say, rather creative interpretations of the Alma-Ata Accords floating around. So, sort of returning to this question, was the system designed in such a way as to prevent change? I mean, we've seen minor little tinkering around the edges, but this fundamental setup of we have this power as the P5, we hold the veto, we're never going to give that up. Is it just impossible to dream of changing this structure?
I'm going to say nothing is ever impossible. I think nothing is infeasible. I always use the same Ursula K. Le Guin quote, so people are sick of me saying it. She has an amazing quote. I actually have it up in my kitchen now. It says, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings."
Mm-hmm.
There is no system or legal structure that is there forever or is impossible to change. Had they set up the UN Security Council in the League of Nations, the US wouldn't have been on it. And it was a 30, 40-year change. I think one of the ways that they stop it changing is the suggestion, this happens all over law. This is back to the US Constitution and their amendments, right? This happens, that there'll be chaos, right? You've two choices. You've order, as Tamsin has, really eloquently set out, or you have chaos. And I think that's actually, because actually, I mean, in lots of ways, like the power that these 5 states have is just technical legal power, because the Security Council doesn't work the way they wanted it to work, or they set it up to work. It actually doesn't work. And it's like they're kind of clinging on to this sort of one thing, like from the past, that give, especially the UK and France, right? Especially the UK and France, that like makes it look like they're more important than they are. And actually, that's not even true anymore politically. There's nothing actually stopping all the rest. If all the rest of the states went, actually, we're going to ignore you. If they acted illegally and just said, we're going to change the law because there's more of us, just a basic customary international law, the majority of the states start doing an alternative practice. And we have been there before with the General Assembly during the 1960s, with their kind of setting up UN peacekeeping when the Security Council wasn't working. They were like, right, actually, you're useless. We're going off doing our own thing. Thanks. And that only lasted for a decade or so, but it was, the rest of the states kind of going, well, the legality here, who knows, but we're doing it. And then that changed. Then now isn't a kind of an acceptance that the General Assembly could theoretically do this again. So I don't think the idea that anything is not, that these things are baked in forever. And the more ridiculous it looks, and maybe, to contradict myself, this might be actually the moment where we can't see it now, but that the US doing the non-veto permanent member thing might actually be the tipping point where everybody else goes, do you know what? No. This is stupid now. This is silly. This isn't, because if all the rest of the states go ahead and say they want this, and they keep vetoing it, all they become is weak. If this played out And all the rest were saying yes, yes, yes. And the five just kept vetoing it. They just look really weak. They lose power in that scenario. And that isn't law, that's politics. But like, and that's just that's one imaginary scenario. So as far as I'm concerned, I mean, it can change. I don't like moments of rupture and politics. These happen often when we don't see them coming, and they're often the ones that cause the most change. But I do, and I think this, like, I do think that this could go badly wrong for the permanent five. Like, this could go badly wrong. I'm not sure it will, but like, I mean, I've dreamed up one scenario there where this change does happen. So yeah, no, I'm not impossibility. I don't think is ever true of politics or legal structures. The world has changed hugely. It does all the time. Legal structures change all the time. So yeah, for me, it's always possible.
Yeah. So you've quoted Ursula Le Guin, which I am here for. I'm now going to go to Shauna Maguire because, she's my sci-fi and fantasy author of choice. And her comment of, I'm unaware of people with power ever willingly giving it up. And I think that that also plays out here as well. And I think that the point we have here is they designed this to maintain their power. They designed a structure, a legal structure that would maintain their power and give them the ability to maintain their power within the legal framework that had been established. I agree with Aoife that change is not impossible. I'm not even that. Like, the UN was born out of the rupture and collapse of the League of Nations. My concern with all of the, what, we're going to go do something else, is that we end up with the same sort of rupture and the same sort of, I'm not going to say order versus chaos, because let's face it, they're not providing order. So let's not even pretend that this is an ordered regime despite what they claim. But that the chaos then means that the P5, who are losing their legitimacy every time they veto their own, the Security Council action to prevent, that would stop them from invading Iraq. Every time they veto Palestinian statehood, every time they veto action that would say that invading Ukraine is illegal, every time that they veto, the idea that maybe the bombing of Gaza is no longer self-defense, if it ever was. Like, the legitimacy keeps fading every time. And honestly, the legitimacy has always been tenuous. And for that one, I actually go back to a comment from the the 60s in the actual council, when African nations as a collective had come to the Security Council originally in 1963, after Portuguese Guinea had engaged in some border incursions into Senegal, asking for Portuguese decolonisation of Portuguese Guinea. And the Security Council went, well, this is an internal affair for Portugal, so we can't do that. And I mean, the border incursion, the facts are hazy. It looks like there were two towns with the same name on either side of the border, and the troops just got their map wrong and went to the wrong one. So it wasn't actually a major event, but it was enough for Senegal to say this is no longer okay. 3 years later, they come back and say, look, this is getting worse, because in retaliation to Senegal getting African states to support them going to the Security Council over this, Portugal started running live fire military exercises on the border, and stray fire had started killing Senegalese citizens. And so the African states came together and said, this is not okay. You need to get Portugal out of Africa now. And the P5 went, well, this is an internal affair, and, non-intervention in matters wholly of a domestic thing. It's not, it hasn't reached a threshold where we can overcome that. And the UN ambassador from Cote d'Ivoire got up and said, look, is this a question of body count? If it is, tell us and we'll make it happen. And then you can do something. And
Wow.
That's quite
like,
stark, isn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
yeah. And that's how seriously the African states took this get
Yeah.
Europeans out of our land.
Yeah.
But the point I'm saying here is that even then, the respect for the Security Council authority was tenuous at best, where they're
Yeah.
saying, look, if this is about body count, we can give you a body count. We don't want to do that, but tell us the number. We'll make it happen to get
Yeah.
you to do something. And we're seeing that just gradually erode. And so while, yes, we may have change is not impossible. And as Aoife said, every time they keep using these vetoes for petty shit,
Yeah.
they lose legitimacy. They come off as weaker and weaker and weaker. And we're seeing that. My concern with the rupture where everyone goes, you know what, we're reforming under a new system where you don't have a veto if you join us in the new system is the consequences of that rupture is my concern. I don't think it'd be a bad thing from a long-term perspective, but I also don't necessarily want to live with the hardship and horror that that might cause. I'm a little
Yep.
selfish that way. And so that's my concern with what I see as the likely way of engaging in the sorts of changes that would improve equality. Because anything that would remove the veto states are going to veto the removal of the veto. Because as Sean and Maguire put it, people with power do not willingly give up power.
Yeah.
So the consequences of that concern me. But 2 years ago, I said maybe they weren't worth it. Now, can't really, can't, if anyone can cut, this is not a visual medium. I'm kind of doing the balancing act on my hands here, with my
Yeah.
hands here, because
Yeah.
you know what? We are seeing appalling uses of force from states all over the place. We are seeing all of these things play out, and the Security Council's vetoing doing anything about it. And so maybe the Security Council isn't actually preventing that chaos that I'm concerned about with their rupture. So
Yeah.
maybe it's
Yeah.
time to go, you know what?
Yeah.
Let's draft a new charter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it does seem kind of extraordinary, doesn't it, that, we have now, as you indicated at the start of the episode, 195 member states and two observer states versus the 50-ish or so that there were in the initial, maybe even less than that, I'm not sure. In the initial drafting, and that this idea that these five retain this immense power over such large numbers of other states. I mean, maybe we are sitting at the cusp of a change where we're seeing such an ineffectual Security Council who is just very fundamentally not doing what one might describe as their job. And these states are realizing, well, actually, that there's more of us. There's a lot more of us, in fact, and maybe it's time for us to sort of, grasp that power and rule by majority. But let's say, I think we would all agree probably that in a smooth transition of power is not going to happen. It will, be vetoed, and that's not going to happen. But let's pretend that we live in some kind of imaginary utopia where we can envision a new world order under a new Security Council type of mechanism. I mean, what would that look like to you? If you could reform the UN Security Council however you want, what would it look like? Aoife?
Well, obviously, it would be a feminist Security Council. I could go with abolition, but I was like, oh, yeah, as you noted in the question, is like, yeah. Because obviously, anti-carceral feminism would tell me that I should just abolish it, frankly. But I think for me, if I was given, carte blanche to do these things. And it's always weird the people who end up actually on the ground actually writing these things can be anyone in reality. I'd start with the purpose, like what's it actually there for? Right. So if we take it's there for international peace and security as the charter sets out. For me as a feminist, I'd be like, well, what does that mean? Right? What does international peace and security actually mean? And for me, and I know there's a concern here with like expanding remit and stuff, but it can do anything at once anyway at the moment. is that it would be an understanding of slow violence, of day-to-day violence, of grinding poverty and the insecurity and unpeace that leads to, the crushing nature, I think, of the way that the global structures work, which creates the traditional forms of insecurity and violence that the UN Security Council is bread and butter. So for me, it would be saying, well, actually, global inequality and those structures, which goes back to those ideas of sort of representativeness. For me, that's where I would start with. I would start with, like, why are we here? And if all we're doing is band-aids, which is actually really what they're at the like Security Council resolutions really under Chapter 7 are band-aids, really. Yep. It's to think about, and this kind of comes back to stuff I'm doing about like feminist tyranny, feminist tyrannicide, is like recognizing the actual tyranny. And like if we look at, say, somewhere like Afghanistan, and we look at the return of grinding horror for those women, and those women knew that was going to happen, and they knew they were going to be abandoned by the West, and like it was really obvious they were being used as a form of like white feminism. To me, it would be thinking about the purposes. The other side of that, kind of more structurally, I think would be, and this is like, I was trying to think about what I would do. It was that it would have to be a deliberative, very transparent, like deeply transparent. This sort of idea, this is sort of, I mean, we used to have secret treaties, and I'm sure if you went back to the 19th century and said, we're going to ban secret treaties, all the international lawyers go, oh no, but nothing will ever be agreed. We did it, and look, there's still like way too many treaties. So this sort of idea that, everything has to be secret. No. We have too many secret courts in international law. We have too many secret. If it affects my body, I want to know how that decision was made. And also, I have no time or truck for the arguments around efficiency, which is all about these reforms. China keeps saying, oh, but we must maintain efficiency. Is it super efficient at the moment? Is it? It's super efficient. It gets loads of things done. Efficiency has nothing to do with the amount of people in the room. Efficiency has nothing to do with whether or not it's transparent. Efficiency is, do you get things done? Do you listen? Do you gather all the right information? Do you make decisions that are deliberative, that are well thought through, so that you're not back putting on more band-aids for the next 30, 40, 50 years, like we're doing, North and South Korea, right? It's been going on a long, long time. So for me, like, this idea of efficiency is, we can't have too many people in the room. No, that's not what efficiency means. So for me, it would be actually thinking about efficiency, but saying, how do we make good decisions? How do we get all the information? How do we listen to the right people? How do we and the idea that it would take too long, I'm sorry, because they are really quick and fast in the way they operate now. I mean, all these like tests that they keep putting in that they're saying would have to be met. I'm like, but you don't mean any of them now. And adding more vetoes is not going to make you any more do the job better. That's not going to impact it. So it's, to me, those would be kind of, and so and to think about that idea of granting people power. I mean, a very practical thing, right? Which nobody will go for. But you could just pick any, like 5, it just rotates. Whoever gets the veto rotates around the world. I mean, no one's going to go for that, but why not? Right? Why not? 5 states, it rotates the way they're very good at doing the rotating thing. That is one thing they actually do. They've thought that one through. I would be as happy with Tuvalu and Mali and Venezuela. Forget about what's going on domestically. They could say that about Russia as well. I'd be as happy with them making a decision about the use of force as I would with the permanent 5. So I've gone from the very sort of big down to a very small thing that I would like just if we have to have one, which I don't think we do at all, actually. It doesn't achieve anything. But if you do, if someone's going to have it, let it roam around the world.
Yeah.
But that's my that's my 2 cents of what I would do.
Well, as you say, I mean, there's no real rationale anymore, is there, for the P5 to have this veto? So you may as well have it on a rotating basis because that's just sharing. That's as good a rationale as any, really. And it's funny what you said sort of about efficiency because that reminds me of my wheelhouse, which is the International Court of Justice, and people are always talking about making reforms to the procedures and things to make it more efficient. Which I'm like, that is really very much beside the point here,
Yeah.
actually. Or they're concerned about lack of usage. They say, oh, no one will come to the court if we do these things. It'll be too controversial. I'm like, have you looked at the docket? I don't think that's a problem. These sort of straw men type arguments. But Tamsin, in your utopia, what does an organization
Okay.
look like?
So in my utopia, we kind of do abolish the Security Council, but not in the way that you think. My utopia then turns the GA into the United Earth Federation government,
Hmm.
and every state's
Is it Star Trek, Tamsin?
look, it's not Starship Troopers. But literally one state, one vote in the United Earth Federation government. And functionally, you elect your state government, who then send their representative to the Earth government, and we're done here. Things are done by, two-third majority vote in the world government, and that's it. There is no veto, and do it that way. Abolish borders by doing this because we're all part of the one world government. So there's none of this border nonsense. There is a task to tackle global inequality and all of those things. And suddenly we have an Earth government that will just tax billionaires and multinational corporations because they can't jump around to different jurisdictions because we have one jurisdiction for tax. And all of the decisions of said Earth government are open to judicial review. So yeah, I'd essentially be adding a supranational layer of government instead of having what we have currently, which is a diplomatic clearinghouse rather than a government organization. So
Yeah,
it's a relatively straightforward one.
Yeah.
But that's kind of my utopia one of abolish borders so we don't have to deal with, oh, but there are all of these refugees. No, they're not. They're just people moving through open borders. That's a good thing. Shut up.
Yeah.
And suddenly we're taxing the shit out of the ultra wealthy because there's only one jurisdiction and they can't move to a more tax-friendly jurisdiction. So politicians don't care about that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it would also show up that, actually, some people actually can't get to Mars in the next 30 years because that could be that's not going to happen, is it? Because you would in that scenario, and gee whiz, you actually can't.
Yep.
Shocking.
But this is the thing. I mean, you can imagine, the world was reimagined in 1945, and we can reimagine a different future. And there's no reason to stop and just say, well, this is what we've got. This is good enough. We can always aim for more and aim for better, even if it's not realistic to bring this in tomorrow. Maybe next year, maybe in 10 years, the world is going to need to change in the not too distant future, just to deal with the climate change consequences, if nothing else.
And I would say, I'm not a utopianist scholar, but I love utopian scholarship because it reminds me about what my next step, queer scholarship, is working towards.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. So, look, it's probably time to wrap up. And of course, in wrapping up each of our episodes, we like to ask our guests 3 questions. And this time around, we get to hear from Aoife. So the 3 questions are, first, what recommendations do you have for anyone who would like to know more about what we've discussed today? Secondly, what are you working on at the moment? And thirdly, what is your current escape route? What are you doing, reading, or viewing that takes your mind off international law?
Okay, so this actually probably was the hardest bit to think about, actually. I'm sure it's the same for everybody. So I'm listening to as an audiobook as I drop off and pick up my kids, Africa's Not a Country by Depot Folayan. Yeah, I think I got that right. And it came out in 2022. And I would like to think that I'm good at not going for the tropes and the stereotypes, but it is a fantastic book. And I think in the context of we're in talking about the African Union and the continent and what it would look like, and what I think it's an excellent kind of setting out the stereotypes used in politics and law, in history, in culture, how we think about aid, how we think about development, how we think about inequality. And I think it's a really good, I mean, it's not law, but I think it gives a really good insight to how like different African voices about their, like, we know you're doing it, we know you're doing it. We know when somebody says something, just as we were saying earlier on, right? They know what this non-veto a permanent seat would mean. The other bit from a more law part, because we've been focusing a lot on the African arguments, but obviously like India and stuff has also been, and South Asian states have also been very vocal in this. And Priyasha Saksena had an article come out there about 4 years ago called "Building the Nation: Sovereignty and International Law in the Decolonisation of South Asia," and that's in the Journal of the History of International Law. And what I like about that, it's a great, I mean, her book is brilliant too on India and statehood, is that moment that they're creating the UN is also when a lot of states that were excluded from those power structures were themselves establishing what they thought, their ideas of sovereignty and their ideas of being a state and where they wanted to be in the international stage, and pushing against that decolonization. Like, and as Tamsin talked about Portuguese earlier on, like those moments of all these states are claiming power and are excluding you because of time, right? You're getting independence just a little bit too late to make those claims, which I don't think was unintentional. So what I'm writing at the moment, I've been trying to do this for a long time, and again, Tamsin will be aware of this, but because I've done a lot of work on tyranny, I've been trying to work on feminist tyrannicide, which I know sounds a bit out there, but everything I do sounds out there. Like there's a real gap in scholarship on tyranny or dictatorships, or whether or not we're talking about the global order, as I did in the book, or domestically, around gender, that goes completely unrecognized. And I've been kind of looking back and looking at even very early historical texts in early modern Europe or in revolutionary South America, or sort of in places like Ghana, Nigeria during the decolonization period. And these women articulating ideas of tyranny, but also how you would overthrow it. And as Tamsin, that's very underdeveloped in my book, especially the queer elements, as Tamsin has rightly called me out for. So this is taking me ages, but I think that's fine. It's taken me ages because really thinking about, well, kind of what I said earlier on, if we do start to see the violence that women face and queer people face and sort of the non-powerful white body faces, what do we then do? If we start recognizing it, then we have to start recognizing that there is a right to overthrow it, as there is a right to tyrannicide. So that's it's taken me ages. And what I'm escaping to, well, see, this is my problem is I was like, well, what am I reading? And then I'm like, you're reading books about like law. So I'm actually reading Jonn Elledge's book about boundaries and exactly, like the foolish incursions, what goes on, the history of them. And then some really lovely, interesting examples of like a town I'd not heard of between Belgium and the Netherlands, that like basically like half your house can be in one and the other half your house is in the other. And like they all get on and carry on. It's not actually like, it's a thing, but it's a thing that is just kind of like they get on with their lives and they're all friends and they all, it's not like the way we conceive of boundaries. And also doing a lot of reading for a prefigurative reading group that I run with Ruth Houghton that people can email if they'd like to join. But what's probably better actually is I'm thoroughly enjoying season 4 of Only Murders in the Building, which I love. I love it. It's hilarious and it's catty and it's clever. And I really love the intergenerational element to it. And sort of like people talking about like it's their body's not working or not working as they want or not being what they want. And it's just so funny. And I'm really looking forward to Silo season 2 because I loved Silo season 1 and it's about to come on. So I watch a lot of television. But yeah, so that's but as I like, I really need to like read some books that aren't related to work.
Well, yeah, no. This is the problem with being super nerds, is that we all just love to read about our subject matters, and I find I have the same problem. But those are some great recommendations. I'm going to note down those. I'm trying to watch more television, so I'm going to note down those series and try to add them to my watch list. So, Aoife, thank you so much for joining us. Tamsin, thank you very much for appearing again. That is the end of this week's episode. We will see you next time.